Hi everyone, I'm Matt Hunt, and today I'm going to walk you through how to use Octopi Poker's library of postflop solver outputs. Now, for this video, I'm going to be assuming that you've never used any kind of poker solver before. If you have used other solvers and you're just new to Octopi specifically, we have a separate video that you can see here, so feel free to jump over to that one if it's more applicable for you. So let's get started. First of all, it's important to know what exactly you're looking at when you see the postflop library. You're not technically running your own solver sims. Our tech team has already run the sims for the flop, and you're seeing the results neatly organized into our library. The solver is calculating certain turn and river spots behind the scenes whenever it's needed, but the bulk of the solving is already done. Our library is constantly growing and we're adding new sims to it all the time, so you'll always have something new and exciting to study during your Octopi membership. In order to access the postflop library from the Octopi homepage, you can click on the Analysis tab up here in the top left. By default, this will take you to the preflop viewer, and you can view a tutorial on how to use the preflop viewer up here. The same goes for the Compare Ranges function, which is just below that over here. But we're headed to the postflop library, so let's click that button right there. Now you're going to get this pop-up on the screen that you can see here. We'll go step by step through your options here. In the top left, you can see the game format that you're looking at. We have various tournament and cash game formats listed there, and we're adding more formats all the time. Let's stick with Chip EV tournament ranges just to start out with, just for simplicity. If you don't know what Chip EV means, it just means that we're in a tournament, but we're looking at it as every chip being worth the same amount, the same way we would in a cash game or the early stages of a tournament. Just below the format selection drop-down menu, you can select the stack size that you want to look at. We're going to go with 40 big blinds for this scenario, since I have a hand that I played where I want to look up the hand and the stack sizes were roughly 40 big blinds. Next, we have to select the preflop action. Now, not all preflop formations and scenarios will be included in the postflop library. If it's a really weird spot where there's a raise, a 3-bet, and somebody cold calls, and you end up going to the flop in a really rare and unlikely scenario, then it's probably not included in the library, especially because solving multi-way scenarios is still extremely difficult even with modern technology. So multi-way postflop sims aren't included in the library just yet. But when it comes to heads-up spots, we have a lot of different scenarios we can look at. And luckily, the hand I want to look at is a heads-up spot. Now, in the hand in question, I was the open raiser in the hijack position. So we're going to just click on the hijack right here, and it's going to zip around to that position. And then we're going to hit raise to 2.3 big blinds. If you're looking up a spot and the raise size happens to be a little bit different, for example, anywhere from 2 to 2.5 big blinds, then it's not going to change the outputs very much, but do be aware that as the open raise size gets larger and larger, the preflop ranges are going to change, and the outputs in the postflop library will become somewhat less applicable. The action's now going to fold around to the big blind, and the big blind is going to call. If you mess up, you can hit the arrow here to go back a step to make sure that you get the action right, or you can hit the refresh button further up here to start the preflop action again from the beginning. But once we've got our preflop action set up, which we do now, we're going to move over to the right side of this pop-up menu, where you can see it says select board and hole cards. First, we're going to select the flop. In this case, it's going to be Jack of clubs, 8 of diamonds, 5 of diamonds. We're also going to select our own hole cards by clicking over here, which in this case are going to be Ace King of hearts. Although this is optional and you can ignore it if you just want to study the spot in general without focusing on a specific hand. We do have the option to add the big blinds hole cards as well, but that might lead us to be a bit too results orientated by focusing on what our opponent actually had, so I'm not going to add that for now. And we have the option to just generate a random flop if we want to study various types of spots for this specific scenario. Plus we have the aggregate reports tab at the bottom, which we're not going to touch for just now. We're going to come back to that in our second video. Right now, we're just going to hit the Review Simulation button to access our first postflop sim. This is where we're taken to the Strategy dashboard. And this is the point at which a lot of people see their first poker sim and get completely overwhelmed, really intimidated, and decide that solver work isn't really for them. But that's not going to be you, so we don't have to worry about that. Let's break down what you're seeing on this screen going from left to right and top to bottom. We've got four main segments of the screen to look at. So let's start with the left side. This side is basically just a place for all the fundamental info about the spot that you're looking at and where you're at in the game tree itself. You can see the flop, the betting actions, and so on. You can also see the game tree itself represented below, starting here. And as you click on different actions and you progress through the tree, you're going to see each of those actions represented in this tree. For now, you're just seeing the big blinds option to check, since that's the only action that's taken here. The check is always represented by an X. When betting options are present, you'll see them represented with a B, something like B25 or B50, to denote the percentage of the pot that's being used. So whenever you see B25, that means the player is betting 1/4 of the pot, and so on. The same is true for raises. For example, R100 means a pot-sized raise. The thing to remember about calculating raise percentages is that the bet is called before the raise amount is applied. So a sizing of R100 is equivalent to calling the bet and then adding the size of that subsequent pot on top of the call. You don't need to worry about this too much, but if you ever see a raise size that looks confusing, this might be why. Below the game tree, after it says end of line, where the hand ends, you have a few options. We're going to cover the side-by-side ranges and the aggregate reports in our second video, but the three dots are a simple way to navigate back to the other menus, as you can see here. We also have a share button if you want to share a specific sim with a friend who's also an Octopi member. You can just enter their screen name along with a message and they'll get the sim in their inbox. Next, we're going to move on to the main bulk of what we'll be looking at here on our strategy dashboard, the range grid. Now, hopefully you've seen this 13 by 13 grid before. It represents all 169 starting hands in No Limit Hold'em. And when it comes to studying poker, this grid is your lifeblood. The majority of the major insights you're going to get from working with solvers are going to come as a product of looking at versions of this grid right here. Pretty easy to read. The offsuit hands are on the bottom left side, the suited hands on the top right, and the pocket pairs along the diagonal. Pocket aces is the top left square, deuces is the bottom right, and then ace deuce off and ace deuce suited are the bottom left and top right corners. As we click through the various parts of the game tree and look at each player's strategy, this grid is going to be where all the strategies are represented. So we're going to be spending a lot of time looking at it and interpreting it. There are also a number of things which will be viewable when you hover over specific hands in the grid, and we'll cover that later when we look at the in-position player's strategy. Now, there's an important aspect of viewing these grids on Octopi to be aware of, which is that what you're seeing here is actually a condensed or more easily viewable version of the full game tree. This spot is a good example of that. The big blind is checking their entire range here, but that doesn't mean that we forced them to check their entire range when we ran the sim. They were given the option to donk bet in this spot or lead out on the flop, but they're not using it at all. If you look just below the range grid here, you can see a checkbox labeled full tree. This is where you can see the other options that the player was given here when the sim was run. If I click that, you can see that the player was given the all-in and the bet 50% options in this particular spot. They just simply chose not to use them. So the solver thinks that the best strategy here is just to check everything every time. And that will be pretty common. In general, you won't need to view the full game tree very often. It's just a good way to check in on which sizing options aren't used in a given spot. And you might find that you like viewing it that way just for a complete perspective. But I personally just have this setting unselected because options that are never used aren't really important to visualize. There are other options down here next to the full tree option. You can switch from the EV view to the equity view, denoted by EQ, which is something we'll come back to a bit later. And you can also change a couple of visual options. Ignore weight will switch from displaying hands according to how often they actually appear in the player's range at this node to displaying them in full. As you can see right here, if I click it, every hand is now in full frequency on the grid. This is mostly used if you want to examine a specific hand combo that's in there at a low frequency and maybe you can't quite see the detail. Finally, we have the option to display the grid in 2D or 3D. This is purely a question of visual preference, really. Personally, I go back and forth on which option I prefer, but it doesn't change your interpretation of the data. It's just an aesthetic option. One helpful thing about it is that 3D can sometimes help you to spot certain low-frequency options which are hard to otherwise notice if you're using 2D. But that's only really going to happen in specific situations. We're going to keep it at 3D for now, but it doesn't really matter too much. Let's now move to the bottom of the screen since we're close to that area already. Here you can see what we call the range map. This is a bit of a complex tool, so let's break it down. Firstly, the number you can see next to the words range map refers to the number of hand combinations contained within the range. In this case, it's 732 out of the possible 1,326 starting combinations in No Limit Hold'em. You don't really need to know this, but it is somewhat useful for understanding roughly how wide or narrow a range really is. Here, it's very wide. It's more than half the deck. What does the range map actually show? It's a breakdown of each individual hand combination within the range, from left to right, strongest to weakest. If you have the EV view selected, then the highest EV hands will be on the left side. If you have EQ selected, it'll be the highest equity hands on the left side. There will be a correlation between these two things, but it's not one-to-one. Switching between the EV and the equity view is sometimes a useful way to understand the real value and playability of certain specific hands and how much equity they can realize. Each hand combo in the range takes up the same amount of horizontal space, but you'll notice that some of them don't fill the space vertically. This represents how often those hands appear in the range in the first place. As before, you can use the Ignore Weight button to get rid of this and just have everything viewed at 100% vertically, but again, this does give you a better sense of how often certain hands actually exist in the range to begin with. The dotted line that you can see along the range map represents either the EV or the equity of each hand, and you can see 5 individual combinations of hole cards along the bottom. The furthest left is the highest EV hand in the range, the furthest right is the lowest EV, and the middle ones represent the 75th, 50th, and 25th percentiles of the range. This gives you a nice snapshot of the types of hands we're thinking about when we examine the overall makeup of a range. If you add the player's hole cards to the scenario, as we've done here, we can see our specific combination of hole cards highlighted on the map, and I'll show you that in a moment. This gives us a nice snapshot of where we are exactly in our range, or how strong our hand is relative to the rest of our range. There are drop-down menus on the right which allow you to choose the sorting of the hands on the range map, just here. I personally almost always keep them sorted by EV first, and if you do that, then sorting them by rank or suit isn't really super necessary. But there are certain circumstances where sorting by rank or suit might be useful, and you'll come across those eventually. For example, you can select your hole cards and then switch between these views. This can help you to understand the properties of specific hands or how effectively these hands actually realize their equity in comparison to each other. You can also zoom in on the upper or lower part of the range map if you want to view things in more detail by dragging the boundaries of the range map to one side or another. If I drag this left side over here, it's going to allow me to really focus in on the portion that excludes where I just dragged. So this is showing me everything from 10-8 down in the range. And if I want to look at the middle part of the range exclusively, I can drag the right side as well. And this is now showing me everything from 10-8 down to pocket 4s. So I can really hone in on a specific part of the range itself here. So that's quite a useful function if you want to really specifically identify a certain part of the range. Next, let's move on to looking at the right side of your screen, which is where the bulk of the useful info will appear that allows you to actually interpret the range grid accurately. At the top, you can see the various decision options which form the player's strategy at this node. In this case, it's just to check every hand in the big blind on this flop, but you'll see that change in a moment when we progress to the next step. Below that, you can see a horizontal bar depicting the strategy for the range as a whole. Again, it's just a pure check 100% of the time here, but that'll be different later on. You can also see the EV of the range listed here. In this case, it's 1.9 big blinds because we're looking at a chip EV tournament spot and there's 6.1 big blinds in the pot. But when you're looking at an ICM tournament spot, you'll see the EV listed in dollars here. We're also going to have a separate horizontal bar for the strategy of our specific hand appear below this range bar. You'll see that in a moment, which is great for gaining an understanding of how our specific hand wants to play relative to our range. If we move down further, we can see the option to review spots that we've recently looked at, which is very handy if you want to conveniently revisit a previous sim. And we also have the option to select the suit of each card and highlight only the hands of that suit. For example, if we wanted to select all the hands containing one diamond, we would just hit one of the diamonds right here. It doesn't really matter which one. And the grid will now highlight all the hands which contain at least one diamond. It'll also create what we call a sub-range, which is a specific portion of the player's overall range. and you can see the strategy for that sub-range just below the strategy for the main range. Immediately, we can see that the EV of the sub-range, which contains 1 diamond, is quite a bit higher than the overall range. Evidently, having at least 1 diamond is good on a board with 2 diamonds on it. We can also highlight, for example, 2 clubs for a backdoor flush draw. If we do that, the EV of the sub-range is actually lower, but this is a bit misleading because when we have 2 clubs in our hand, we can't have top pair on this board because the jack of clubs is the high card. So we always have to look out for things that might cause us to draw the wrong conclusions. We wouldn't want to start assuming that having a backdoor flush draw was actually a bad thing here. Finally, on this page, we have 3 tabs that we can choose between on the middle right area of the screen: hand classes, blockers and more, and the range graph. Let's start with the hand classes tab. This tab allows us to view the different categories of hands within the range, the frequencies at which they occur within the range rounded to the nearest 1%, and the strategies those hands are taking as a whole. Obviously, we're just seeing everything checking in this spot, but it's still useful to know, for example, that the big blind only has a set 1% of the time here, or a flush draw only 7% of the time. You can hover over any of these categories to get a sense of the various properties of that group of hands. For example, if I hover over a set here, I can see how many combos there are that fit that category, its overall EV, and the exact percentage of that category within the range. This gives you greater insight into what we call the composition of the range at this node. In other words, which types of hands are in the range, and at which approximate frequencies do those hands appear. Naturally, the grayed out boxes here are the hand categories which aren't possible on this board. Obviously, you can't have quads on a Jack 8-5 flop, for example. The blockers and more tab and the range graph tab are probably not tools that you'll need to worry about right away. We'll come back to those in our more advanced video for those of you who are already experienced in using solvers. So now that we've taken a look at each of the individual components of what we're seeing here, let's actually dive into this sim itself to give you a sense of how to use the tools to actually draw meaningful conclusions about a hand or scenario. Since we're focused on the hijack strategy in this spot, we're going to click through to let us actually see that strategy. We just click the check option, the X over here on the left side, and it takes us through to the next node of the game tree. Once we click on that, we finally get to see a meaningful representation of an actual strategy here, instead of just the range check strategy that the big blind is using. In this case, the hijack strategy has 3 options that are used: the check, the B75 or a 3/4 pot, and then a negligible frequency of the B25 for quarter pot. Now, these extremely low frequency options will pop up from time to time. In this case, the B25 is used only 0.9% of the time. When you see this, it's usually pretty safe to just eliminate those options from your strategy for a specific spot, because you really won't lose any EV by doing so. You're probably wondering where the threshold is for when we can safely eliminate a specific option from our strategy. Is it 1%, 10%, 30%? There's no hard boundary for this, but a really good rule of thumb when looking at solver outputs is you want to check to see whether there are any specific hands or categories of hands that strongly favor using this specific option. If there aren't any, and that option is just being used at low frequencies by a bunch of different hands, then eliminating it is fine. But if there are specific hands or categories of hands that strongly favor using that specific size, then you'll usually want to try to figure out a way to ensure that you don't eliminate that size completely, because it will usually cost you some EV to eliminate it. In this spot, the B25 is only a tiny portion of the strategy, and there definitely aren't any hands that strongly favor it here, so we can ignore it. We're just going to figure out the broad strokes of how the hijack is choosing between check and bet 75 in this spot. If we scan through the various hand classes and categories here, we can get a sense of how the range is constructed. We can see each class highlighted if we hover over it, as you can see right here. For example, this is the overpairs, this is third pair, this is the combo draws, and so on. And if we click on it, we can view it in more detail. I'm going to click on each of the strongest 4 classes here, the sets, the 2 pairs, the overpairs, and the top pairs, to see how we're playing the top of our range in this spot. Immediately, you can really see the main takeaways quite clearly. Almost all of the top pair or better is always betting, with only pocket jacks for top set and Jack 7 suited, our weakest top pair, doing slightly more checking. So that gives us a pretty clear indication of how we're going to want to play our strong hands here. We can also see that the range map alters to highlight the selected portions of the range, giving us a clear sense of how each individual hand prefers to play. Next, we're going to look at all the one pair hands below top pair. So we're going to highlight under pair, second pair, third pair, and low pair. Under pair in this case refers to a pocket pair that's below top pair, not an under pair to the entire board. We can see that this particular sub-range is checking only slightly more often than it's betting, 55 to 44, which is a clear indicator that we have some tough decisions in this spot. When we get ambiguous spots like this, we can take note of the outliers. For example, ace-8 heavily favors betting here, while pocket 7s and 6s heavily favor checking. Beyond that, we'd have to start getting more granular about the individual combinations of hands and their specific properties, but we don't need to worry about that right now. Our next category of hands is our draws. So I'm going to highlight all of the draws here, the combo draws, flush draws, and straight draws. If we highlight these classes together, the sub-range is betting at a much higher frequency, and there aren't many outliers here. Again, we'd have to get more granular, which we don't really need to do right now. We just need to be aware that the hijack should be betting most of their draws here. Finally, let's look at all the other hands, the ace high, the king high, and the nothing hands, which are specifically queen high or worse without a draw. This is often an awkward category to figure out since they're some of our weakest hands, but we do have some useful things we can establish here. The very weakest stuff, the queen 7 suited and queen 6 suited, is always betting, as is king 9 offsuit. And there's a general tendency towards betting more often with a card 7 or lower in our hand. We can use the blockers and more tab to explore these things in more detail, but we won't do that just yet. So that's an overall perspective on the hijack strategy here. It's pretty aggressive, betting fairly often with a fairly large size. But the question you're probably asking right now is, why does it look this way? Well, that's the hard part of solver work, but thankfully we have some tools that can make it much easier. We're going to cover most of those in our second, more advanced video, focusing particularly on the side-by-side view and the aggregate reports. But for now, let's quickly look at how we can approach looking at turns and rivers, and then we'll wrap up this video. Let's say we want to look at the turn card here after the hijack uses bet 75 and then the big blind is going to call right here. We're going to click on the B75 and then the call, and then we're going to select the turn card. In this case, it's going to be the queen of hearts. We can now see the big blind's turn strategy, and once again, there's no donk betting, it's just a pure check. We're just going to proceed straight to looking at the hijack's turn strategy versus a check so that I can show you the next functionality here. The process here would be exactly the same. We look at the options the hijack has, which in this case are B30, B50, and B75. Now, what we can also do to get a clearer sense of our overall strategy here is use one really cool function that provides a ton of insight, which is the show runouts button right here. If we go over to this button, then we're going to get a little warning that says computation may take a bit. Doesn't really take that long, so don't worry too much about that. And now we can see how we're going to play on all possible turn cards, including with both our range and our specific hand, the ace king of hearts. We can sort these turn cards in a variety of ways. One of my favorite ways to do this is to sort by suit and then by rank, because this gives you a really clear perspective on how you're playing different cards. So as you can see here with our range, if the turn is a high spade, we're doing quite a lot of betting. A medium spade, 10, 9, 8, or 7, a little bit less betting. Low spade, about the same. You can see high hearts are pretty good. Again, pretty much all high cards are quite good for us here. And then a diamond in particular, you can see there's a real trend towards not using the B50. You can see that the diamond makes quite a lot of difference here when we are facing a turn decision. So immediately there's a great ability for us to kind of understand that the diamond has a big impact there. And specifically for ace king, you can also see what this hand is going to want to do on different types of turn cards. You can see an ace or a king. We're just betting 50, basically the entire time, basically full frequency. And this is a great way to really understand what your strategy is going to look like across all turn runouts. And you can do the same thing for the river. So this is a really fantastic tool. Depending on what the board texture is, you may find different displays more useful. You can sort by aggression level, which cards are we playing a bit more aggressively, which cards are we putting the most money in, and you can see the ones that have some all-in shoving here are going to be the ones that we put the most money in, obviously. We can also then see which ones are we checking the most. We can see which ones are we betting certain specific sizings on the most. But depending on what the board is, you're going to find it more useful to maybe look at suit and then rank, or potentially rank and then suit. If there was no flush draw, then of course there would probably be a lot less differentiation in terms of how we would play certain suits. So you may not find it as useful to look at specific suits and rather focus on the rank. But generally speaking, one way or another, there's a lot you can do here to really figure out what your turn strategy is going to look like, both with your range and then with individual hands as well. So there are some more functions that we haven't unpacked yet in full, but I'm going to save that for the second video that's going to be more advanced. If you already understand solvers to a good degree, then you can pick up in that video and check that one out. And hopefully those of you who are new to solvers will have gotten a great foundation from this video. You'll have a little bit more understanding of what the different functionalities are and how to read the outputs. And you can join me again in that second video where we'll teach you all about the more complex aspects of how to get the most out of Octopi Poker. That's it from me for now. I'll see you guys very soon.